Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly surreal and, honestly, pretty fascinating piece of literature, Elias S.H.F. Thorne's masterpiece, Waiting for the Shift to End. Now, this is a story entirely focused on isolated workers who are just completely trapped in massive, mysterious machinery. It's a profound, sometimes uncomfortable look at the sheer absurdity of endless labor. I mean, if you've ever felt like a tiny, insignificant cog in a giant, uncaring machine, well, Thorne's world is going to feel incredibly familiar to you. So let's explore how this novel breaks down the human search for meaning when the work itself makes absolutely no sense.
Right off the bat, Thorne hits us with this incredible opening epigraph, and it just perfectly captures the core problem of the whole novel. The machines themselves, the giant cauldron, the unending railway, they don't care. They just exist. It's only the human being trapped in the middle of all this who suffers the luxury of inquiry. And I say luxury, but it's really an absolute torment, right? The torment of constantly asking, why on earth am I doing this?
All right, let's jump into Section 1, the industrial absurdity, and look at two extremes of endless labor. To really explore this idea, Thorne splits his narrative into two parallel, totally disconnected worlds. On one side, we have a guy named Grynt down in Factory Sublevel 7. He's completely stationary, totally isolated, and his job is just stirring this massive 47-foot cauldron of mysterious gray-brown sludge with a 9-foot paddle for decades. His world is silent and completely internal. But then, on the flip side, we have the Line. This is a 4-man crew operating a huge train that literally never stops, barreling across a flat, featureless void. Their world is all about constant forward motion. It's incredibly loud, hypersocial, and fueled by these desperate, unending arguments just to keep the silence away. It's basically two completely different flavors of mechanical nightmare.
Which brings us to Section 2, Two Oceans of Drowning, the Struggle for Purpose.
Because despite those massive physical differences we just talked about, both parties are drowning in the exact same existential struggle. Take Grynt, for instance. He is absolutely obsessed with this one crucial philosophical distinction about the food he's stirring for the faceless workers somewhere above him. He wants to know, does this food sustain them or does it merely continue them? And that's a huge difference. Sustains means they flourish, they grow, the food actually makes them more than they were, but continues, that just means it's fuel. It only perpetuates their mechanical state so they can keep working. Grynt is terrified that his entire life's work only achieves the latter.
Meanwhile, up on the train, the crew is struggling with that exact same lack of purpose, but they all process it entirely differently based on their specific jobs. Marit manages the valves, and he is desperately seeking some kind of meaning and destination. Then you've got Vaush on the drive assembly, who aggressively rejects the idea of meaning altogether and just focuses purely on function. The oiler, he finds comfort in the raw mechanical correspondence of his gauges and the firebox. And finally, Fettel, who handles the couplings, copes through this state of endless physical readiness. They are all trapped on this train that never arrives anywhere, basically using their specific mechanical domains as shields to protect their minds from the void.
Moving right along to Section 3, Mechanisms of Meaning and how these guys are surviving the gap.
So, how do you actually survive the gap between what you're doing and why you're doing it? Well, for Grynt, the total isolation forces his brain to adapt in some wild ways. He literally develops this fiercely urgent, highly argumentative internal conscience that practically acts as a second character in the room with him. To find meaning, he invents these incredibly strict, totally self-made rules, like telling himself he can never, ever let go of his stirring paddle. He even maps out specific zones on his iron platform, establishing a zone of appropriate discomfort, just so he can feel something specific. And during his one tiny 14-minute shift break, he actually forces himself to find profound aesthetic beauty in the slow boiling of the industrial sludge. He is literally building a universe out of absolute nothingness.
Now, contrast Grynt's loud, chaotic internal arguments with Fettel up on the train. Fettel's coping mechanism is 100% physical. Picture this. When he's lying in his bunk, in the pitch black, his hands are continuously practicing his coupling sequence against thin air. Pin, chain, spring. 8 seconds. Over and over. He rehearses his duty against literally nothing, just to anchor himself to something he can control. It's his way of keeping the existential terror at bay by perfecting the one tiny sliver of the world he actually owns. And this leads us to Section 4, the connecting steam and the overlap of existential doubt. What's so brilliant about Thorne's writing here is that while Grynt and the train crew never actually meet, he links their stories through this incredibly powerful visual metaphor, steam. Down in Sublevel 7, Grynt is constantly watching the steam from his cauldron escape up into the dark ceiling, and up on the surface, the oiler watches the engine's steam vent out into the endless gray outside the train.
For both of them, the steam represents the freedom and the release that they are completely denied. The steam gets to leave. They have to stay.
And as they both sit there watching that steam, this identical, haunting question hits them. Is there anyone doing this who is not us? It hits Grynt in his 9th hour of stirring, and crazy enough, it arrives at the exact same moment for Moret on the train, who scribbles it down on a notepad. It's this desperate, heartbreaking reach for solidarity across the mechanical void.
For Moret, though, the questions just keep escalating until it's full-blown panic. Where are we going? Who sent us? He's demanding to know if there's a builder, if there's a master plan, if this track actually leads to a destination, or if they're just running in a giant circle. He's absolutely paralyzed by the lack of consent and the total lack of information about this endless journey they're on.
But then Vaush completely shuts Moret down with this brutally pragmatic line. It gets us through the night. For Vaush, the machine is honest. A piston moves because pressure acts on it, right? There's no existential gap there where doubt can creep in. Vaush chooses to focus purely on the nuts and bolts of the work to keep the terror away. He doesn't care about the destination. He just needs the confirmation that the wheels are still turning.
But of course, that tension brings us to Section 5, the breaking point and the catalyst for change. Because the equilibrium of their perpetual labor simply can't last forever. 17. It sounds like such a random, mundane number, right? But for the train crew, it's a massive emotional gut punch. It's the exact number of food tins they have left. Suddenly, this endless philosophical journey has a literal ticking clock, and when you couple that with a widening crack they find in their engine's fire grate, they are suddenly forced to wake up to the reality that the machine is not just going to run forever on its own.
Meanwhile, down in the basement, Grynt reaches his own breaking point. After decades of absolute silence, he finally receives a letter back from the Bureau of Sub-Level Operations. It confirms his product volume is consistent and even promises to send him a new paddle. But crucially, and this is the soul-crushing part, it explicitly refuses to answer his desperate question about whether the food actually does well by the people eating it. They tell him, point blank, that moral questions are outside their area of assessment. So they hear him, sure, but they utterly refuse to validate the moral meaning of his entire life's work.
Finally, we hit Section 6, the final choice, and facing the terrifying unknown.
So what happens when that illusion of perpetual safety is finally ripped away? We reach the climax. Grynt, holding his worn-out paddle, finally turns and considers opening a mysterious flush door in his south wall, a door he has intentionally ignored for decades. He realizes he can't just keep stirring in the dark anymore. And on the train, the crew actually agrees to do the unthinkable. They bank the boiler. They are going to bring the train to a halt and step outside into the gray void to search for parts and food.
And Moret perfectly summarizes why they have no choice but to do this. He says, not knowing keeps us comfortable. Knowing is at least honest. They finally realize that the safety of meaningless labor is just an illusion. You can't just keep your head down and maintain the machine forever. Eventually, the food runs out, the paddle wears down, the grate cracks. You have to face what's outside the machine.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly haunting question. It's the question Thorne is essentially asking all of us about our own daily grinds, our own endless shifts. Would you stay in the safety of meaningless labor, just ignoring the door on the wall and keeping the engine running? Or would you have the courage to stop the machine, step outside, and embrace the terrifying silence of the unknown, just for the chance at something honest? Think about that the next time you clock in. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.